For those joining us, hello, please like and subscribe. Naomi Klein doesn't need an introduction. And I'm not going to do she doesn't need an introduction, but now I'm going to introduce her. I'm just not going to introduce her. Everyone knows who she is. You've read her books, you've read her articles, you've seen her on countless things.
Maybe clarify that I didn't write the beauty myth, that I don't believe chemtrails are a government conspiracy. I think COVID is real. I think Bill Gates is a terrible guy, but not because he's implanting things into us through vaccines, but because he's destroying education and agriculture. Anyway, Naomi, that's all. That's all the introduction I need.
That's a great intro.
Not that Naomi.
She's not the Naomi who's going around blowing up 5G masks or whatever the other Naomi is up to. Where to begin? Do you know what? Let's begin with Biden. So, minimum wage. Bombs on Syria, though. So both the minimum wage and bombs in Syria have been dropped in two different ways. Now, I suppose there's two ways of looking at it. And I guess I'm just interested in terms of a theory. Well, no. Well, that's what I was going to put to you.
Yeah, okay.
Biden, I suppose there's one way, like, in terms of the US left, in terms of one way of looking at it is, well, actually things have been won materially, and that shows that struggle pays off versus not sowing illusions in Biden's administration. So I'm just interested, what's your take so far from a progressive perspective about where the Biden administration is and how where the left should kind of stand right now?
I mean, I think the sooner that there is clarity that Biden is Biden and Kamala Harris is Kamala Harris, and that they are exactly who we always knew they were when we opposed them in the primaries, the sooner the better. And so now I think people clearly know, and that this is a continuation of U.S. imperialism and corporatism as usual. And yet there are things that we can get done under that kind of administration that we couldn't under a Trump administration or a Bush administration, just because of just the straight up, like, you know, when you're dealing with Republicans and progressives push, you just literally are just not their voters. So they just don't have any reason to care whatsoever. And there have been things that you know have been pushed for and won so far, like canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, you know, some decent action on climate, some marginal progress on people's relief for COVID, not nearly enough, right, on any front. But I just think it's good to have clarity that this is the war party. The Democratic Party always has been. This is the party of corporate power. We're going to have to push them like hell. But you know, you have to remember that during the Trump years, we didn't even really bother pushing Trump because there was nothing to push. There was no way we were going to do anything but sort of build our own power in parallel and maybe win some things at the state level, you know, the municipal level. But we certainly weren't going to win them at the federal level. So, you know, that's where we're at. We knew that this is who he is. This is who he's always been. This is why we opposed him. This is why we supported Bernie. Like, it's not news. But there were, I think, a fair number of people who were a little confused by the sort of progressive talk that marked the early days of the administration. And it was like, well, maybe he's really seen the light and he wants to be FDR. No, he doesn't want to be FDR, you know. He wants to be Joe Biden. But that said, you know, what do you do with that information? Just go like that, you know, I'm just gonna scream at people on Twitter and tell them they're idiots for thinking they can get anything done. No, you try to get things done anyway. Isn't that inspiring?
I think a realistic assessment is the foundation of them being inspired. It's a good jumping off point into inspiration. And I think not that screaming at people on Twitter for being idiots or whatever isn't therapeutic in its own way. Yeah, I mean, in terms of now, so you've got the so-called squad in Congress, and they've got new blood now. You've got Cory Bush, you've got Jamal Bowman, yeah.
Maybe Nina Turner on the way because she's running.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and obviously we have AOC who came down from socialist heaven one day. But I mean, what do you think this? Because you've got them, and then obviously they surfed the wave of a movement. They were put there by a movement that exists. They're not, detached from that. What do you think the pressure points are? What do you think the strategy now is for the squad and the movement that it represents?
Well, I think you can see what their strategy is, which is, there's no honeymoon for Biden. They're being extremely critical of the failure to come through, for starters, on the $2,000 checks, which was promised, on the $15 minimum wage. I think some of them are more focused on foreign policy than others, and we need more. They've been very critical on a continuation of brutal immigration policies, which, once again, of course, we should expect because Biden was Obama's vice president. Obama was the deporter in chief. So the squad, needs to stay as independent as possible, build their own power, as a kind of a pincer with social movements pushing from the outside and then pushing from the inside. But I think that the big difference is that now they can potentially get some bills passed through Congress. And I know that there's some exciting legislation coming up in the next few days and weeks from those new members, from Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. So definitely look for that. And, I guess the main thing to know about the squad is that, they are an ad hoc group. And so I think they would, I think we'd all benefit from more coordination between them, probably. It's not like there is a Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is becoming more progressive, which is co-chaired by Pramila Jayapal, who's also excellent. But I think we all just need to get more coordinated movements on the outside, and it's the challenge of organizing, right? Movements need to organize across silos, and maybe there could be more coordination within the squad and the Progressive Caucus, because there's power there, and. Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think people are doing really well in terms of not repeating the mistakes of the Obama years, of just kind of demobilizing and kind of acting as fans of the new administration instead of, of opponents. I always like what Annie Leonard at Greenpeace said, that she wasn't choosing a friend, she was choosing an opponent in who she decided to support for president. And Obama's and Biden's a better opponent than Trump from a progressive perspective. So I think that the really dangerous thing would have been a repeat of that kind of Obama fan relationship with a politician. What I like about Biden is precisely that he is such an uninteresting and uncharismatic figure. I think that's very good. I think our worst case scenario is when we have a brutal, neoliberal imperialist and everybody's got a massive crush on him. I think that's really a big problem and that we had during the Obama years. And we lost years to this kind of give the guy a chance. Let's see what the long game is. We're 2 months in and people are like, oh, okay, I get it. I see who you are. We need to fight with you now. That's good. Obviously it would have been better if Bernie were president. We tried, Owen.
You bloody well did try, Naomi. You tried very, very hard. You were a campaigning machine during the primaries. I have to say, the general election here in Britain was obviously apocalyptic.
Mm-hmm.
I will still wake up with sweat on my face thinking about that moment of the exit poll.
Yeah.
And then we clung on to Bernie Sanders as a little life draft.
We've been through a lot, haven't we, Owen?
It's been a long year and a half. It's been a long few years. What you're talking about, David Sirota talks about this.
At least we're losing bigger struggles.
Yeah, no, that was the thing, because I was like, it's terrible we lost here, but if we win Bernie, that's like the global hegemon.
So we need to edit that sort of, fail, try again, fail again, fail better. So I think it's sort of like fail again, fail bigger.
Fail bigger. Really go. Really set your sights,
Yes.
your hopes, your aspirations. How big can we fail? We can do this. Yeah, I mean, David, let me just, sorry. Oh, come here, you. Oh, my cat wants to say hello. This is Rickman. You going to say hello? You going to say hello to Naomi?
No, not really.
Yeah, David Soroka, he's the former Bernie speechwriter, and he talked about this during the Women's March after the 2016 elections, and it had something like this placard saying, if Clinton had won, we'd just be at lunch now. And there was that theory of politics some liberals have. Brunch, not lunch, brunch.
Brunch is key.
Brunch ski. I mean, look, it's 5 p.m. You're at 9 a.m. and you're way more on the ball than I am. Yeah, and it was that idea of that theory of politics is we'll make politics boring again, so you won't have to think about it. That's what their promise was, wasn't it? So do you see that? Because in 2008, there was this sense of shiny, charismatic Obama, and he'll solve everything. He'll pull the levers for you. You don't have to care. And then obviously people were let down and disappointed. But do you think that, because now you've got the Sunrise Movement, you've got BLM, you've got these extra, these movements on the streets, and obviously the pandemic interferes with all of that. BLM did start, of course, under the Obama presidency, so you did get
all of these movements did. I mean, people learned that lesson around mobilization in the second term of Obama, where there was, oops, sorry, I'm beeping. There was we lost the first term basically of Obama. By his second term, people were like, okay, we have to get in the streets, and you saw the emergence of several really powerful confrontational movements, including Occupy Wall Street, and that sort of turns into the Bernie campaign or parts of it. So yeah, I mean, we did but I think that that's important because I think that for the more cynical among us, there's a tendency to say, oh, it's just Obama redux. We're back where we were, right? Because Biden is Obama, essentially. We're getting Obama-like policies with the military and immigration, and to a lesser extent, the economy, but to a large extent. But we are not the same as we were in 2008. That's what's important to understand. The social movements aren't the same. We didn't lose the Trump years in the sense that people continued to organize, people continued to develop their analysis, their relationships, and the legacy of the Sanders campaign is real in terms of the pressure on the Biden administration that it's already exerted.
Where do you think the energy behind Trumpism is going to go? I mean, obviously, there's different schools of thoughts on this, and Marx said men make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. And the role of the individual in history is open to debate, and at different moments has more of a role. But some would say he has got this specific personality that actually made this phenomenon what it was. Others would say, well, actually, that energy could end up finding a far more effective, brutal operator who could end up being more devastatingly effective. So, I mean, what do you think in terms of the threat of some form of fascism, which, in 2024, maybe finding a better candidate? Where do you think the energy is going to go in the next few years that drove the Trump phenomenon?
Well, I do. It will go somewhere. And it's definitely not going away because it never went away. And it just, it was magnified by Trump, but Trump didn't invent it. And, all I know is that we make it stronger, we give it more life, the more that neoliberals are able to be neoliberals in power under Biden. So the more that the Democrats are the party of austerity, are the party of corporations, are the party of war, the more we super empower the reanimation of whatever is going to come out of the fascist right. Whether it's another Trump run, whether it's a Trump son run, whether it's, not a Trump, but an even worse, more effective fascist. I mean, what's really interesting, if you watch Fox and in particular Tucker Carlson, you really see how kind of relentlessly they are hitting the big tech is after you, like big business, and a very kind of anti-corporate, populist, fascist message. And there is a direct relationship between neoliberal centrist parties doing the work of big business and the effective rise of that form of right-wing populism, or so-called populism. So I don't know. We can't control them, Owen. All we can do is try to steal their fuel, right? And their fuel is the success of the the corporate imperialist neoliberal project, right? Obviously, their fuel is also white supremacy and misogyny and homophobia and transphobia and all of that. That's always been there, and it will be there. The question is whether we give it this extra power of look at these Democrats. They have nothing to offer you. They're liars. They're corrupt. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party is really good at giving them that fuel. So it's a scary moment because the signs are not good in terms of just what we've seen this week, right? With minimum wage, with the failure to come up with those $2,000 checks, with the failure, with bombs dropping on Syria. I mean, it's all just kind of writing Tucker Carlson's script for them, right?
And he is, I have to say, horrifyingly effective
at
what he does. You can see him as an extremely effective Republican candidate, which lots of people think he might end up being.
No, I think that's right. And that would be absolutely not a good thing.
Because he combines often populist messaging on the economy with obviously horrendous racism. So you can see both sides he can exploit as the Democrats.
I mean, he's like Bannon, but he's, obviously he's telegenic. He's the most popular, TV guy in America right now, I believe, more than Hannity.
Yeah, and Steve Bannon is not telegenic. He uses Lynx Africa aftershave deodorant. Weird. Not the weirdest thing about him.
Well, that doesn't really read on TV. That's not the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is there seems to be more and more shirts layering.
There's lots of shirts going on.
Okay.
People are very excited on Patreon that I was chatting to you, and they've got really great questions. So James Grant, talking about the shock doctrine, how it applies to the COVID era. What are the lessons of disaster capitalism for our present moment of crisis? What can the left do or argue to avoid the recovery being more economic shock therapy leading to more inequality and exploitation?
Okay, I'm just going to do a very quick version of this because I think we've talked about this a lot. But look, we need to resist their disaster opportunism, their disaster capitalism, their attempts to use the cover of the pandemic to push, every bad policy under the sun, and they'll continue to do that. But the lessons of the 2008 financial crisis is that, and here I'm going to quote one of my book titles, no is not enough. It is not enough just to say, stop doing that. We know what you're doing. We know what you're up to. You're not actually solving the crisis. You're just taking advantage of it. It's important to do that. But what I deeply believe is that we will lose unless we are simultaneously advancing a very proactive vision for how to solve the multiple overlapping crises we face. And that's why, I think we should be, dead focused on a Green New Deal vision as a way to solve economic crises, climate crises, racial justice crises, all of the intersecting crises of our age. We can do that.
And another question relates to that for Max Counter. With COVID, we've seen governments produce near unlimited budget to tackle the pandemic. With the evidence of this, how does it change the strategy for persuading the government to do the same with the climate emergency, which is obviously a bit of a bigger deal than COVID is, however horrendous COVID has been?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's our economies need stimulus. People need jobs. We need a plan. We need a mission, and we can design that mission around these intersecting crises. I mean, the 1930s, when the original New Deal was introduced, was a time of obviously economic crisis, but it was also ecological crisis. It was the time of the Dust Bowl. There were also public health crises. TB was spreading, all over the place. It was, and so the vision for the Green New Deal needs to be one that is about investing in the infrastructure of care, of health, of public health, which is low carbon work if we do it right, and simultaneously divesting from the extractive economy and just taking what we need, and protecting cycles of regeneration, creating huge numbers of green jobs. The bottom line is, I think we are in a much better situation than we were, say, 5 years ago, or even more recently, when so much of the discussion of climate action and climate policy was focused on things like a carbon tax or cap and trade, and not a actual industrial strategy for the next economy. And the reason why it matters that we've finally moved to a more expansive vision of what climate action could look like, and that's what I think the Green New Deal represents, is that this is obviously a plan for any economy in crisis, right? Whereas in 2008, when climate action was more associated with carbon pricing, it was very easy for governments to just say, hey, we're in an economic crisis, we can't care about climate anymore, right? And many governments in Europe did that, including left governments, who just said, like, sorry, we've got to put food on people on the table, we can't worry about climate anymore. At the Green New Deal approach, whatever you want to call it, is a plan to marry the need for well-paying jobs, and income, income supports of all kinds, and climate action at its most basic. So I actually think we're in a better situation than we are when the economy is doing great, supposedly, because when you have a economy in a growth cycle, it's harder to argue for this kind of massive change. I've tried, and people are like, yeah, but that was the Great Depression and the Second World War. We're not going to do something like that when things are supposedly fine, right? And that's the sort of argument that I was hearing, 13 months ago.
Because that's always the danger, isn't it? That when you get growing support actually for some form of systemic change to deal with an emergency like the climate emergency, and then you get the so-called, these voices of so-called moderation who divert that energy into the most limited, just kind of trim around the edges, fiddle around the edges of the system, and then present that as sufficient, when actually in a period of upheaval like this, there is at least an opportunity to demand far more reaching systemic change. It seems more realistic.
It is. I mean, we are in a time of big problems, and tinkering is not going to do it. And I think, one thing I can say about Biden that is an improvement over Obama is that he does seem to understand that we are in a time of at least 4 intersecting crises, and he sort of lists them, right? Of obviously the economy, COVID, climate, and racial injustice. And given the depths of the COVID crisis and the economic crisis, he could have just kind of brushed climate aside, and he isn't doing that. And I think that is a testament to the organizing of young activists in Sunrise, and the pressure of the squad, and the victories of the Bernie camp in pushing for these committees, right? There was an agreement between the two campaigns to have committees on certain issues, including climate, and AOC chaired the climate one, and Varshini Prakash, who's executive director of Sunrise, was on that. And I think they had a huge impact, at least on the framing. So that's one area where I think we're actually in surprisingly good shape, because I wouldn't have been at all surprised if Biden had just completely forgotten about climate change in the midst of the other crises he's dealing with.
Well, that point you made about younger activists, I do think is very interesting, and in terms of something which isn't not remarked upon enough. I mean, it's both an opportunity and a challenge, in that in 1968, the most pro-war generation in the United States were the under 25s, and the most anti-war were older Americans at the time. I mean, people look back at student protests at the time. Most people didn't go to university back then, and actually the polling showed most university students support the Vietnam War. In the mid-80s, the most pro-Reagan demographic were young Americans, and it's the same in Britain in 1983 when the Tories won a landslide victory under Thatcher. the youth voted for the Tories.
Wow.
And that has dramatically changed in both United States, because there's this cliche, isn't there, that, of course, the young are naive and idealistic, and then they're schooled by the realities of life, and they become conservative as maturity takes them to understand the terrible realities, the hard-nosed realities of life. I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? The way actually that younger people are both, it's not everywhere. In places like Hungary, young people are not progressive. Mm-hmm. In places like Spain and Britain and the United States, it is younger people. It's millennials and Zoomers. But at the same time, you do have a very entrenched conservative bloc amongst often older white property owners. I mean, that's the challenge as well as the opportunity. But there is, mm-hmm. What do you think about this generational gap that's opened up, which is without precedent in democratic history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's. I think there is a huge generational shift, and it isn't just like young people are more progressive; they're more involved in activism. I think it is that this generation, like particularly Gen Z, is absolutely anti-capitalist in their analysis. I mean, they want to change like the underlying system. They really are not interested in the kind of siloing of politics that even millennials were sort of took for granted, right? Of like, okay, you have to choose your issue and just focus on that issue. And so that is the biggest shift that I see. And certainly millennials, I think, are obviously more progressive than my generation. And a lot of this has to do with just having spent your entire adult life in the post-2008 financial crisis. But even if you compare it with the 1960s wave of progressive youth, the focus on the economy is different. It is what's different, because the radicalism of the 1960s was mainly focused on the war and on so-called cultural issues, and less a sort of real bread and butter analysis of capitalism. And I think that is a big shift. And I see it just, among the students I teach at Rutgers, which is a, big public university, very diverse student body. I think we have the highest number of percentage of students who are the first in their families to go to a post-secondary institution. And just even from one semester to the next, I see my students getting more and more radical. So I think it's a big deal. And it's not, like I said, it's not just about like, are you going to a protest? Do you identify as progressive? It's how deep are you interested in going? And they're interested in going pretty deep.
I have to say, there's an online phenomenon of Zoom. I'm an older millennial. Zoomers mocking millennials. I find it so distressing. It's really upsetting. You've just written an absolutely brilliant must-read, and everyone must immediately read, whether they've watched this interview live or listened to it on the podcast. After you finished, do look it up on The Intercept. India targets climate activists with the help of big tech. Tech giants like Google and Facebook appear to be aiding and abetting a vicious government campaign against Indian climate activists. I want to talk about this. I did an event before the pandemic with Arundhati Roy, which was, she was on great form, but it was distressing and disturbing. What has happened to India, which is obviously the world's biggest democracy, though democracy with several caveats, is very, very disturbing. And things have deteriorated in the 2 years since I had that event with, I have to say. But it's interesting talking about this in terms of just talk about in terms of tech giants, because often, again, this isn't something the left is talking about enough. And you got this when Trump was taken off Twitter. I think some people raise actually this could be quite problematic for various reasons, but people, there was all this liberal rejoicing on social media. It was difficult to kind of have a conversation about that. But I'd just be interested just to unpack this, because obviously they don't have China, which is the biggest potential market on earth. It is the second biggest. So just talk through what's going on in India, what this activism is about, and what big tech are doing.
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand about big tech and these very sort of different trends around what companies are doing in North America and Europe, and what they're doing in places like India, is, on the surface, it seems like a real contradiction, because since it was clear that Trump had lost the election or was going to lose the election, there has been all of this sort of posturing from big tech companies to show how serious they are about human rights and stopping hate speech and stopping conspiracies, and they're putting warnings, and they're finally getting serious about incitement on their platforms. And we're hearing about the Supreme Court of Facebook, which is supposedly going to be a way that Facebook is going to regulate itself. And then you look at what they're doing in India, and they are happily amplifying incredible, just overt, kind of genocidal language from politicians associated with Modi. Doing things like claiming Muslims are deliberately spreading COVID, and doing hashtags like Corona Jihad and things like that. And in India, this regularly tips into real violence, right? And so, you think about all these documentaries and hand wringing from Facebook and Twitter about, oh, they just feel so bad about what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya, and they'll never let that happen again. And meanwhile, they are collaborating with the Modi government in two ways. One, by not cracking down on obvious hate speech when it comes from the Hindu nationalists, and by collaborating with them when they want to invade the privacy of activists like Disha Ravi, a young climate activist. But there are hundreds of people who have faced this, where they created this absolutely make-believe controversy over a so-called digital toolkit, right? So, Owen, I know that these things are probably the bane of your existence. I know they are of mine, right? Where like every single activist campaign puts together a collectivist toolkit, and you get one of these emails, and it's like, take a picture of yourself with, a hashtag, right? Like, I mean, how many of these have you received, Owen? Like
today, about 5.
Right. So
hashtag save the world.
Exactly. And it's like, I mean, I don't mean to be too dismissive of it, but this is not like dangerous activism, right? I mean, this is just like collectivism 101, stand with India's farmers, right? India's farmers have been in revolt for months, and there has not been enough international solidarity. So this was an attempt by people in the South Asian diaspora and in India to try to kind of wake people up. Like, this is the biggest movement in India, potentially in India's modern history. They're fighting against neoliberal policies. They're fighting for their lives. People should stand with India's farmers. So that's what this guide was about. It was like, stand with farmers, take a picture, send a video, go to an Indian embassy if you can. And there was a line in it that said, like, challenge the yoga and chai image of India. Okay. This was sent to Greta Thunberg, who tweeted it. And then all hell breaks loose. And there's this thing, they're calling it the Greta Toolkit, the Toolkit conspiracy, a plan to destroy India. They're claiming it's seditious. They're claiming it's incitement. They're claiming it's a plan to break India apart. I mean, it's just so over the top, utterly fictional, right? But with very real world results, because several young climate activists in India get arrested, and most prominently Disha Ravi, who brought Fridays for Future to India. She was in prison for 8 days, interrogated for 5 days. I mean, the coverage in Indian media has been so over the top, presenting her as, they call her the linchpin of the toolkit conspiracy. I mean, Owen, I am telling you that the toolkit is like the mismatch between the content of what they're talking about and the actual real world implications of it are just so misaligned. And so there's been, Fridays for Future has been raising the alarm on this. And yeah, I just wrote this piece. The part of it that I think is we really need to focus on is the complicity of these tech companies, because there's a lot of regret in places like Google and companies like Google and Facebook that they lost access to China's market over this sort of early misguided idea that they shouldn't actively collaborate with state censorship and hunt down activists. Because in the early days of the internet in China, there were several high-profile cases of companies, like most prominently Yahoo, helped the Chinese government to like find the location of a dissident, right? Who put something online that the Chinese government didn't like, and Yahoo was like, okay, this is where the IP address it came from. This is how to find them. This led to an uproar, and these companies pulled out, including Google, under pressure, also from their workers. And they have been watching the Chinese market with much regret as competitors. Chinese companies have cornered that market, and now India seems to be going the way of China and has introduced a digital media bill that is just outrageous in the powers that it gives to the state to just take down whatever they don't like. They call it mischievous content. What the hell is mischievous content? Or any content that maligns the quote unquote integrity of India. What the hell is that? How do you malign the integrity of a country? I'm sure I've just done it right now, and that's that line about yoga and chai. That's what they seized on. They said they are maligning the integrity of India by saying that they're going to, kind of expose India's yoga and chai image for, and show the real human rights abuses behind it. So, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Arundhati. I mean, think about the outspoken critics of India. They are in danger right now under these laws. So we really need to speak out, and I think use the greatest leverage we have, which is the desire of these tech companies to be seen as ethical in Europe and North America, so as to avoid real regulation, right? So they have very different interests, except it's all the same interest, which is maximum profits. So in North America and Europe, getting those maximum profits means showing that you can be responsible in self-regulating hate speech and conspiracy so that you don't actually get regulated. In India, the way to protect your bottom line is to do the exact opposite and just collaborate with a government that is itself spreading hate speech. And there's an opportunity there, I think, to pit those two projects against each other.
Yeah, and we've seen it with places like Turkey as well, which also have laws which ban people from insulting the president and so on. And there's been a whole palaver with Twitter and YouTube and so on. Mm-hmm. Before we end on an optimistic note, which we will, Naomi, we will end on an optimistic note. That's how this ends. That's how it was. That's how we bring this to a close, because we don't want people to feel depressed listening to us. We want them to be inspired and fight back, which they will be. They always are from you. But before I do, have you been following British politics? For your own well-being, I recommend not. But unless how masochistic are you?
So far, okay, I've mainly followed British politics lately since the election by listening to the news quiz.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, I don't listen to the news quiz, but I'm sure it's none
of my British friends do. But I'm like, it's a really good way to find out what happened in the UK last week with jokes that I don't necessarily understand, but then I can kind of piece it together.
I think British politics it's not a funny joke. It's certainly not funny, but it could well be construed as a joke. Well, here's a hilarious joke. Labour currently are opposing the Tories' plans to raise corporation tax and the Tories' proposals to have a windfall tax on companies that have profited from the pandemic. And I think this is interesting.
What?
A lot of this has been a bit like, oh, come on, Labour, you need to oppose the Tories. You've already let them get away with one of the worst, most catastrophic bunglings of a pandemic on earth, in which nearly 1 in every 500 Britons has died. A worse death rate than America. So it's worse than Trump's handling of the pandemic. The worst death rate apart from Slovenia and Belgium. Maybe you can oppose the Tories. And they were like, Labour, we'll oppose the Tories. We'll
oppose the one good thing they're doing.
Well, they're now opposing the Tories raising taxes on big business, and it's not great. It's not ideal. Any tips for people? We're desperate, Naomi, is what I'm saying. What anything we should do? Any tips? Any hope before we end on a high? What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? What do you think just listening to that? What does that make you think?
I mean, I feel it's a mess, obviously, and we can't sugarcoat the fact that we have, we've suffered some major losses in North America and in the UK. But as I said earlier, we're failing bigger, right? And maybe there's some hint in that, in the sense that I think that so much of the British left has been focused on the prime ministership, right, and really kind of trying to get the highest levers of power. And I wonder, and I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I wonder if maybe some more accessible levers of power at the city level, for instance, labor-controlled cities, haven't been used enough to try to be more ambitious about what could even happen in London, what could happen in Manchester, and I think the reason to do that is not like, well, start small, start local, but to really win back some trust about what progressive policies can accomplish, what left policies can accomplish in people's lives. Yeah, I mean, that's where I might say we should focus energy. Does that make any sense?
It does actually, yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's some of the best advice I've heard so far. We're a bit lost right now, but so any help and solidarity is always appreciated. Finally, let's end on
all my solidarity. And I think it was an absolutely worthy and courageous and exciting thing to do to reach for the top in the way that the left in the UK has done. But you are where you are.
They'll never forgive us for it. Finally, optimism and hope. I look at the struggle at the moment, for example, Amazon workers in a right-to-work, anti-union state in the United States. Yeah. That's some hope. That's very hopeful.
Absolutely.
What are the things at the moment? What kind of struggles are you looking at where you think these are the seeds of the future? These are the things we can build
on? Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that organizing in the workplace, tech worker organizing, I mean, talking about pressure on big tech, it's pressure from users, but the most promising pressure is the pressure that's happening inside these companies. A company like Amazon has real potential for solidarities, interesting solidarities within the company between warehouse workers and programmers, more white collar workers. And even people like us, Owen, we are Amazon workers in a way. Our books are for sale on Amazon, cultural producers. And so these companies are so big that I think that they create really interesting opportunities for organizing almost like within them. And in a way, it kind of brings me back to the no logo days of thinking about how we, use a corporation's brand against it. And now we have these giants that are the everything store and major cultural actors and tech companies and controlling the cloud and doing massive government contracts like Amazon. I think we've only seen glimpses, frankly, of the organizing potential within a company like that. And if you look at the organizing in New York City that led to blocking Amazon's proposed headquarters there, it's a glimpse of that kind of cross-movement organizing and just using the Amazon umbrella, right? I mean, it brought together migrant rights organizers who were saying, this Amazon does business with ICE. It puts our communities under surveillance. You had people, obviously you had labor organizers, you had anti-gentrification housing rights organizers, and it all came together under the kind of anti-Amazon umbrella. So I think that's really exciting. There's also a really great group of workers who call themselves Amazon Workers for Climate Justice, who are looking at the carbon footprint of that company. So, that gives me a ton of hope. Indigenous-led struggles against fossil fuel infrastructure. We're seeing some amazing organizing against a project called Line 3, which is shaping up to be the next Standing Rock. And I continue to get so much hope from the climate justice movement, particularly the young climate justice movement. Just looking at the way the Fridays for Future network, right? This network that was inspired by Greta, but is much bigger than Greta. Young people in there, some of them are preteens, teens, and they get on. They're in touch with each other. They call each other their sisters. When Disha Ravi was arrested, this network just came together in incredible ways to defend her, to call for her release, and they're extraordinary. So yeah, lots of places for hope.
That's a great place to end. That is a very hopeful note. Naomi, it's been an absolute honor. It's always a pleasure, always an honor. Your work is I mean, I always say it. I don't care how much it's slightly embarrassing, but when I was a wee boy, no, you're not that much older than me, but when I was a teenager, in the era of there is no alternative, and there were a few voices emerging at the time who were dissidents in that period, and you were one of them. So you partly inspired me to be a writer. So you've got that to answer for.
Owen,
it's true. It's true. I'm not
we
saying
tried to keep the door open. We tried to keep the door open a crack for all you kids to come just bust it down when you were ready.
I'm not
and then call us sellouts.
I know. Well, indeed. Yeah. Well, I get that from my mum. So, Naomi, lots of love. That was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who listened. Bye, everyone.
Please support this channel for independent thought, discussion of the most important issues that we face.